All right, Dobry večer, dear host, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our discussion focusing on Ukrainian and Baltic perspectives panel discussion on the upcoming NATO Summit in Washington, D.C. My name is Mark Plavicic, and I'm a program administrator for the Central East European Coalition and officer for the National Federation of Croatian Americans Culture Foundation. Now, on behalf of the Central East European Coalition, it is my honor to welcome award-winning world affairs journalist Trudy Rubin, speaking about her current visit to the front lines in Ukraine. And Trudy Rubin is a worldview foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and a member of the Inquirer's editorial board. Her column runs regularly in many other newspapers around the United States. In 2018, she won the Overseas Press Club Award for the best international commentary in any medium. She was a finalist of the Pulitzer several times and has received the Arthur Ross Award for distinguished analysis of foreign affairs from the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Edward Wintel Prize for the International Reporting. And she's the author of The Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration in Iraq, and has also written for the Christian Science Monitor and The Economist of London. And she's graduated at Smith College and London School of Economics. And Ms. Rubin travels extensively and has special expertise in the Middle East, South Asia, and Russia and Eastern Europe. And just days ago, she returned from her trip to Ukraine, being granted a personal interview with President Zelensky. In this discussion, Trudy will now be monitoring a discussion with a member of the Ukrainian parliament, Mr. Yeger Cherniev, and Minister of the Estonian parliament, Mr. Eerik-Niiles Kross, and will share their own regional and unique perspectives about, and that will take center stage in the upcoming NATO Summit, including the collective defense initiatives, security commitments in supporting Ukraine and deterring Russian aggression and expansion. Now, before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, so I recommend everyone to mute themselves, and please use the chat for questions or comments. And each speaker will speak for at least 5 minutes, and then there will be a time for Q&A at the end. Now, without any further ado, I just want to say we're very fortunate to have Trudy and our speakers to join us this evening. And Trudy, I'll give you the floor. Thank you so much for being here.
Mark, can I ask you a favor? Is there a way to change the screen so that the three of us are on the screen? It's a little bit disconcerting to be looking at everyone at the same time.
Let's see.
And then the audience can't really see us.
Trudy, I know if it helps, you could turn it from gallery view to speaker view. If you are in the top right corner of, let's see, of your view box, and that might change it for you at least. Anyone watching?
All right,
yes.
I just would like to, now I'm getting you. Let me see if I get me. I don't want to look at me. I want to look at the guests. And so now I'm seeing one guest, but I'm not seeing Yeger.
Trudy, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. All right.
It's okay.
All right, you're here. I'm off in a corner, which is fine, but it would be more convenient if the three of us were on the screen. And I'm sorry, I just expected somebody else would do that for me. And I'm not quite sure how, but let me just begin. So as you may know, I just came back from Ukraine. And so there's two things that I'll talk about. I mean, obviously, we're just heading into the NATO Summit. And the president, in my interview with him, was quite clear and clearly not very happy about the fact that we all know that there is going to be no invitation, no beginning of a process. The only language that's being used is a bridge to NATO, which is the kind of bland language that drives Ukrainians crazy, understandably. And there will be bilateral agreements, but the word agreement has a bad odor. since agreement has no compulsion attached to it. It's not a treaty, and it hasn't been passed by a parliament, and therefore all parties are free to ignore it, especially if Donald Trump is elected president in November. So the question is, what is going to come out of this summit? From my conversations, I know that there's a lot of hope that at minimum, there'll be some package of new weaponry that will be announced. But actually, I don't know how optimistic we can be, because US officials are still running around trying to pin down how many Patriot systems will be available for delivery when they were really needed months ago, years ago, and if not yesterday, then certainly tomorrow. But with all of the bits of news posted around about Israel has 8 systems in mothballs, I would be delighted to hear that the US convinced Israel to turn over some of those systems. After all, they were loaned by the United States to Israel, and Israel has publicly announced that they're not going to be using them. And in the shoot down of Iranian missiles that happened not long ago with major US assistance, the Patriots were hardly called into use. It was Israeli systems that were used. Now there's talk about a possible war with Hezbollah in the north. And so, of course, there'll be talk about, oh, Israel needs to keep those systems, even though I'm pretty clear they won't it's pretty clear they won't be of particular use. They are old technology, but for Ukraine, they would be a godsend. So it certainly makes me nervous, and I haven't had any conversations with US officials since I got back a few days ago. I've been busy writing up my trip. But right now, it seems there are only 4 Patriot systems on offer, and heaven knows when they'll get to Ukraine. And perhaps there's been some progress with Israel. If there has been, I'm not aware of it. I always am dubious, since this issue of Israel's Patriots has been on the table for months and nothing has come out of it, even though we are giving Israel so much aid that you would think we had the leverage to demand the return of a loan. So the question is, what will be the deliverables? And what President Zelensky said to me is, if NATO is not going to invite us, then at least they should give us what we need to defend ourselves. That also brings us to the question of why the why the F-16s, also old technology, have not been delivered. And actually, one question that I'm going to ask you, Yeger, is about what we discussed, that there are pilots available with English capacity who are ready to fly, but they need the additional training. And it seems that the US still hasn't moved them to the beginning of the queue in Arizona, where training could have taken place a year ago or more, but didn't. So, it all boils down to what is going to come out of this summit that makes it better than the last summit in Vilnius. And given the election results in France, given the European Parliament elections, where right-wingers have made gains, right now, this summit looks very depressing to me, because the future is rather grim. Macron, as you know, was a stalwart, had become a stalwart supporter, and now he is going to be a lame duck at best. Hopefully there will not be a national rally prime minister of the far right wing of Marine Le Pen, who is in Putin's pocket and actually accepted loans from him in the past. So that's one thing based on my interview with the president. What else I would say is from traveling around to visiting many different units of the 59th Brigade and the 28th Brigade in the Pokrovsk area and closer to Chasiv Yar. There's good news and there's bad news. The bad news first is that every unit I spoke with was seriously undermanned by up to 50%, which means exhaustion. And it's unclear when new units will be rotating in, because from what I was hearing, and you may know better, and I'm going to stop talking in a couple of minutes, but the question is the weapons and training for the new units. And what I was hearing is that the full kit isn't there for many of these new units. But the shortage of manpower was what I heard over and over. Secondly, arrival of artillery shells and necessary spare parts. What I was hearing in the Pokrovsk area is that it's arriving very, very slowly. It may be that it is arriving more quickly, certainly to special forces units, perhaps closer to Chasiv Yar, although I was somewhat closer, and I was hearing from commanders that they still weren't seeing it in the amount necessary to really overcome the gap. I was also hearing that these sort of kamikaze advances by the Russians was still going on, where they send out draftees from the occupied territories that Russia either squeezes into service or they join up because they have no other jobs. Those guys go first, they get slaughtered. Then come the Russian prisoners in the military, they get slaughtered. And after about 10 waves of these, I was being told that you still sometimes get breakthroughs because it just exhausts the Ukrainian troops. The good news is, as I'm sure you all know, that the incredible inventiveness, mobility, drone imagination and production is giving results. Everywhere I went, some new form of drone was being worked on in drone factories that I was at in Kiev and elsewhere. New products were constantly coming up. The question is numbers and do they get to the units that need them? But inventiveness, imagination, creativity were just visible everywhere that I went. Just to give you an example, and this is when Ukraine was in its worst point back in the early spring, shortage of artillery shells was overwhelming. I was hearing all kinds of stories about drones being made with pipes, with beer cans, but also with explosives being taken out of old tank mines, boiled and put into shells that were created with 3D printers and then used instead of artillery shells. So I constantly am taking my hat off to Ukrainian ingenuity. But it's still a hard, I'm going to get the metaphor wrong, but it's still extremely difficult if the artillery is not arriving, the F-16s are not arriving, and the Patriots are God knows where. So I'm going to stop. I mean, this sounds gloomy. Yes, I will say that I came away not entirely gloomy because I had some people that I respect highly senior in the various intelligence services telling me or prognosticating that Ukraine could hold the line and that 2025 could be different. And I think I can see possibilities, especially the taking of Crimea or the cutting off of Crimea. But hanging over this is the big black cloud called Donald Trump. So I'm going to stop here and let me give a fuller introduction to Yeger Cherniev, who's a member of the parliament, the Rada. He's deputy chairman of the Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence of the Rada, and chairman of the permanent delegation of Ukraine at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And so over to you, Yeger, and please tell us how you see the situation at present and what are your expectations for the NATO summit.
Thank you, Trudy, for the invitation. Good evening. I hope it's evening in the US because it's early morning in Ukraine. It's 2 a.m. But it's a pleasure for me to be here with you, distinguished guests, and I will try to describe the situation in Ukraine. Trudy, you are right. In many moments that you already described, what is happening on the front line, and thank you for coming interviewing our soldiers and delivering this information to the US audience, because it's important to have this information from those people who saw this with her own eyes. You're right that situation is not so easy, but it's better, and it's getting better than it was before the decision of the US Congress about a new package for Ukraine for 2024. And actually, using these FPV drones and other things, it was the only one option how we could replace, at some point, of course, the shortage of artillery shells. And we are good in this. We still use a lot. We develop a lot of different drones, bombers, drone kamikaze, and others. But Russia also learn lessons and also develop from their side electronic warfare, how to counteract to our drones. They develop a lot of their own drones and use a lot of drones, and that's why we have the situation on the battlefield when we almost don't have any equipment, armed vehicles near the front line, because when you start to use tank or armed vehicle or something else, it will be the next minute destroyed by FPV drone from both sides. So now we have some distance between our position without any equipment on the battlefield. But because of much more large number of manpower of Russians, and because they don't care about their losses, they use a lot of people, they use a lot of soldiers who, among the soldiers, they have conscript people, they have prisoners, they have different people, actually without motivation. Their motivation to not to be killed in the rear if they will not fulfill the order to go forward on our position. So they don't have a lot of option to be alive. That's why we have some problems, because we call it like a mid wave, when they use their units, their soldiers in assault attacks every several hours. our soldiers kill, for example, 5, 6, 10 of them. Then through the bodies of their soldiers, they start a new attack in a few hours. This is craziness, but this is the reality. That's why they time to time push us from some small villages, and we are losing some territories. But again, probably the worst point of this war was several months ago, when we lost Avdiivka, when we lost Ocheretine, some other small villages near this city, because of shortage of ammunition, because of problem with our manpower. But again, now it's getting better, because we start to receive some amount of shells. It's not enough still. The ratio was 1 to 12, 1 to 20. Now it's 1 to 10, 1 to 7, something like this. We also have a new law about mobilization or conscription of people, and it's already give us some results. I cannot say some proper numbers, but the numbers increased several times in comparison with the, for example, March or April, because the law started in May. So I think we will have much better situation in a few months, when these new people will be trained and will join the concrete brigades on the battlefield. And you know, these two things, the mobilization process and the weapon issue, is connected, because this is also about motivation of people. When they understand that they will come to join some brigades, and these brigades doesn't have artillery shells, doesn't have weapon art vehicles, etc., etc., of course they don't want to join it, and then of course don't want to go to the army and to go to the war. Now when the situation is getting better, the situation with weapon and with mobilization too. But again, we need more weapon, and this is the problem number one. Not only shells, but artillery systems, armed vehicles, of course, air defense systems, not only Patriots, because Patriots, it's a great complex, very expensive, and we understand it, the system which can intercept ballistic missiles. The only Patriot system and SAM-T, the only two systems in the world can do this. And it's important to have it to protect our big cities and our critical infrastructure. But we also need some probably smallest objective air defense systems, not so sophisticated on the front line, because Russia used their air jets with these guided bombs very freely, and this is the big problem, probably one of the biggest problem on the battlefield, because they can use it on the distance up to 40 kilometers from the occupied territory, and destroy not only our positions but the whole villages with these huge bombs. The biggest one is 3,000 of kilo, so it can destroy the whole street on the village with all the buildings. And they use it against Kharkiv, for example. They use it against Zaporizhia with ballistic missiles, with cruise missiles, with these missiles from C-300 and C-400 from their air defense systems, but they can use it as land-to-land missiles.
Let me just interrupt, because I want to come back to glide bombs, but just for time purposes, I'm just going to ask Mr. Kross to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to questions and pick up on some of these issues. I just want to introduce Eerik-Niiles Kross, who is an Estonian diplomat, intelligence chief, entrepreneur, and politician. And he's a member of the Estonian parliament and the general rapporteur on Russian Democratic Forces for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council on Europe. And he was a leading figure in the anti-Soviet resistance movement in Soviet-occupied Estonia. Now, I cannot see him, so I'm
on my screen. I'm
there
just
you
above
are.
you.
Thank you. Welcome. Okay. So let us pick up with you, and I would appreciate it if you could talk about what the Baltic states understand that some other members of NATO may not fully understand, or maybe by now they do. But, you know, how you see the upcoming NATO summit, and also how Russia has been pressing at the edges of Estonia.
Thank you. If I may, maybe later also add some comments to the Ukrainian situation.
Please.
I was there. I spent a week at the front lines in March. That was end of March. That was probably the toughest time, as talking to the units as well, and actually came back relatively hopeful. I mean, even if it was very difficult, clearly everybody was tired, but there was absolutely no sign of low morale. All the fighters, from commanders to soldiers, were, you know, committed, and they said, you know, they will fight. The U.S. Congress will give us aid, will not give us aid. We will all fight and die if needed. But that was encouraging. Nonetheless, the overall picture, of course, is worrisome. I agree with everything that was said about lack of certain weapons, etc. Regarding the Baltic states, obviously we have been following the aggression very closely, and not since 2022, but since 2014. And have been trying to ring the alarm bells in Brussels and Washington since then. And we have always been considered, until recently, until February 22, we were considered the paranoid Balts who are, you know, crying the wolf and do not understand the Russians and do not let the big boys mediate with Putin, and basically we were the troublemakers. That has somewhat changed, but overall we were told in after February 24th, we were told from many capitals in NATO, sometimes even publicly, that yes, you were right. You were right about the Russians, and we see it now, and we should have listened to you. And what has happened in NATO since then is that until 22, even the threat picture, the understanding of the threat was not uniform. It was very different. Western Europe saw the Russian threat differently than we did, and it's not just the Baltics. It's Poland, also Romania lately, of course, Ukraine, and the Scandinavians are sort of in this realm that are now, you know, getting ready for the next war. And then there is the rest of Europe that hasn't decided if they are ready to pay for it or not. They are definitely not ready to fight it yet. Nonetheless, since February 22, this threat, understanding of the threat in NATO is pretty much, on the same sheet. We all understand the threat the same. It's serious. Now, where there is still maybe not disagreement, but decisions haven't been finalized, is what to do about it. The defense planning has gotten a lot better, and I can give you a long lecture about the terrible history of defense planning for the eastern flank since 2004 when we joined. Just a little funny fact. When the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, obviously there were no contingency planning for the Baltic states yet. So we entered the door and said, well, let's start to plan. And then it turned out that for many NATO members, defense planning for the Baltic states was considered too provocative to the Russians. So it wasn't even, no weapons, no real actions, even planning on paper was avoided. We have gone a very, very long way since then, and the Madrid summit pretty much, in Madrid, NATO agreed on the eastern flank defense, which is now on paper quite credible, but it's still not filled with capabilities and real assets. So there's still a long way to go. While doing all that, of course, the Balts have been trying to play a leading role, being microscopic in real world. This leadership has more been just poking the others to help Ukraine as much as possible. We strongly believe that the only final solution, if you wish, for the war is to bring Ukraine to NATO. It's not gonna end before that. Right now, it looks. I mean, there of course will be no invitation coming in Washington, and what is going to happen, when it's going to happen, it's hard to tell. It's not going to happen. There will be no major policy change, of course, during this administration before elections, and God knows what happens after the elections. So realistically, it's a 5-year perspective what Ukraine has to survive. And the question is it possible? I do think it's possible, despite the relatively worrisome big numbers. I give you some sort of big picture numbers just to have some context what is going on in the war. Ammunition has been mentioned many times. The US aid package is absolutely critically important, and even if Ukraine survived without it for 6 months, and the Russians couldn't move, even with 10 to 20 times more shells per Ukrainian shells, they couldn't break through, which is incredible if you think about it. I mean, Ukraine is now the best, the strongest fighting force in Europe by far. There's no other country that could do that. Now, the US might be able to do that if they get their act together. Nonetheless, even the aid package, the US aid package, is not going to solve the ammunition problem. It will bring maybe for certain period the ratio to 1 to 5, maybe 1 to 3 to be optimistic, but not more. There will be no Ukrainian superiority. There is also the Czech aid package. The Czechs are buying mostly old Soviet ammunition around the world. This is 1 million shells that they have. I think it's financed by now, and some of it is already in Ukraine. Some of it is low quality, etc. There are some other aid packages, and Europeans are also getting their act together. So things are coming, but there are limits, and the limits are the following: that right now the Russians probably produce around 4 to 5 million shells a year, big caliber. The West combined, I mean, Europe and the US, produce 1.5 million. But the Russian requirement is 10 million. That's what they say they need a year. So they, of course, do not have enough according to their plan. But they have the North Koreans, and they have the Chinese, and they have some others. I mean, if you think about it, that the North Koreans, at least according to the available data, give more shells to the Russians than the Americans give to Ukrainians. That's shameful. And nothing happens to anybody, right? Money-wise, the Russians put probably about $150 billion into the war a year. So to keep Ukraine fighting, the 60 billion aid package needs to be repeated next year, and needs to be matched by the Europeans. That's, at this point, very unlikely to happen, particularly on the US side. On the European side, don't know, because this sense of urgency is hitting in. And for the Europeans, actually, the period of waiting for the US aid package was very necessary, because that's probably the first time when in many West European capitals this idea sank in, that what if we do not have the Americans helping us? And that is also important for the defense of Europe, not just Ukraine. So during that time, many governments actually started to really deliver, particularly smaller countries, though, but nonetheless, the Swedes, the Finns have been very good. The Germans, despite their slowness in certain areas, have actually delivered quite well. The French speak a lot and deliver very little. But overall, European participation is not too disappointing at the moment. So that's my 5 cents for now. I'm happy to answer question.
Let me just start with a question for you. How much difference do you think the French elections will make? As you say, there was a lot of talk from Macron, but not too much delivery, some delivery. How much difference will the European Parliament elections make? Do you think Europe will be able to hold together, and can they Trump-proof their own performance, or compensate, shall we say, if Trump is elected?
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? But
Right.
the big blocks here. First of all, EU Parliament elections, despite some increase on the far right, the result is not catastrophic. It's actually quite okay. The same mainstream political party coalition will continue, which is the EPP, the moderate conservatives, the liberals, and social democrats. So it's pretty much more of the same, with the exception that for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, a real East European is on a high position in the EU, namely Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas will be the High Representative on Foreign Affairs. So of course, one can say that the EU foreign minister, so to say, doesn't really matter, and is not really, not really a foreign minister. But nonetheless, it's a very very important psychological change in the EU, because Brussels has kept so far all those important positions in the hands of the sort of safe old Western politicians. And for the first time, you have a young, vocally Russia-critical politician from a new country. So that is a change, and that hearing cries from the Kremlin against it, that works. And that same thing goes about the French. Despite the fact that the French actual assistance in real assets has not been that great, Macron lately has gotten the messaging right. When he says French troops could go to Ukraine, even if they don't go, that's exactly what Putin needs to hear, because until now, mostly the West has played this sort of weird game of setting self-imposed red lines. I mean, we are constantly deterring ourselves, particularly Washington and Berlin, which is an interesting phenomenon in NATO, because in NATO, I would say until 2014, certain European countries held NATO back, and then the US tried to push it to do more. Now the US is holding NATO back, unfortunately. Yeah. And this also goes about all those, we can talk about it later, some really hard to understand policies not to strike military targets in Russia with US weapons, targets that cause the most damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure right now, attempts to limit Ukrainian right to hit oil refineries and oil export facilities, which are under all international legal norms, military targets. This is totally crazy.
Yes, it's timidity versus insanity, the two choices we Americans have at the polls. Let me just add, we have some questions coming in from the audience, so I just want to ask Yeger one of them. The US is against inviting Ukraine to NATO. Instead, they're offering a bridge. Do you think this so-called bridge is a real step bringing Ukraine closer to NATO, or is it just an empty metaphor?
Is it a question to me, or is it a question?
No, I wanted to ask you that. As from the Ukrainian perspective, how much does a bridge mean? Or can I sell you that bridge? Or
yeah, I will start from the main point. Ukraine considers the invitation as the only one legal instrument to confirm our accession to NATO. All these open doors, bridges, and other things is just words how to not to give us the invitation. We can try to find some other wording, but to be honest, the only word which means our future accession, it's invitation. As I understand this new word bridge for Ukraine, it's a list of quite practical steps how to increase our interoperability with NATO and became closer to a member of NATO de facto, just to have this all this interoperability, join some probably joint venture in our defense sphere or something else that already alliance has in NATO. When time will allow us to have this invitation de jure and this membership de jure, and just to be prepared for this point, we have to start it now. But we started this preparation period years and years ago. In 2008, it was the first step with this open door policy, and we were not offered, unfortunately, but countries, that member states said that, well, we will decide about your map for Ukraine in upcoming times, not even years. And we have been waiting for this map for 12 years. Now we stood behind the open door, but cannot go through these doors. Now we have a bridge with all these things that, okay, it's also important to have interoperability and to have practical steps how to become a member state, but it's not about political steps. It's not about, and when we asked for invitation, we even underlined that it's probably should be a political invitation. We understand that it shouldn't be the start of process of ratification of this invitation in the countries of in the member states, but it's like a signal that this 33rd seat is reserved, is booked for you, Ukraine, and we are waiting for you after the end of this war, for example, or with these concrete conditions, because you know, it's strange to hear that Ukraine is not ready for NATO because of something, because we don't have the list, because of what we are not ready yet. And when we ask this list, let's give us the reforms that should be done to be ready. NATO don't want to be clear in these conditions, to be clear in this list of reforms. So it's quite blurry situation when we have open door policy, bridges or something else, but don't have real steps on our path to the NATO accession.
Let me just ask you one more, and then I'll throw out a question to both of you. At this point, what could this NATO summit produce? Is there anything it can produce that would enable Ukraine not to call it a failure? Is there any minimum of something that you could be given, offered, that would at least partially make up for the fact that the bridge to nowhere still exists?
Well, I think we have to divide tactical and strategic steps. On the tactical level, I think it would be great to have some announcement of a new Patriot system, 7 Patriot system, 10 Patriot system, I don't know how many, as much as our alliance can. For tactical level, it would be great, and it will be great results to have it the next day or next month in Ukraine to protect our cities. On the strategic level, of course, it should be some next step after the decision of the Vilnius summit to show the progress for both sides, even for 3 sides, even for 4 sides. So, I mean, not only for Ukraine, that Ukraine is going to NATO and look, we do the next steps. But for Russia also, that Russia doesn't have a veto right on the decisions, because now it looks like NATO is looking on the position of Russia, of Kremlin, and because of their position, don't want to give some invitation or something else. And the third, probably, the third side, this is other countries, not the countries of NATO, but for example, the global South countries, which is looking on what is happening and will make some consequences. Is NATO still strong? Is NATO still safe confidence? Is NATO still determined? So, or not? Or should we seek some protection in China or with other bloc or axis of evil? So this is the point. I think the consequences of this NATO summit in Washington will influence on not only on Ukraine, Russia, or NATO countries, but on the whole world.
Yes. Well, let me ask you both, and Mr. Kross first. The big question of Trump, I mean, obviously, it's the black cloud hanging over the NATO summit and the whole future of NATO. Can Europe compensate? And is it possible to Trump-proof NATO?
I mean, there are many questions there now. First of all, there's also the assumption that Trump will actually try to leave NATO or do whatever strange with Ukraine assistance. There has been a lot of noise around that, and there was a lot of noise around it, as you all remember, during Trump's first presidency. But if you look at the record, nothing like that actually happened. It was actually the Trump administration that gave Ukraine first military assistance, even if it was asked several times from the Obama administration. When Ukraine asked for military assistance or for weapons in 2014, and the Russians invaded eastern Ukraine, then all that the Americans gave Ukraine was military ready-made meals, sandwiches. That was what Americans gave. And the first military packages started, of course, under weird circumstances, but under Trump. And he didn't leave it. I mean, that doesn't mean that this might not happen. So overall, yes, of course, Europe is concerned. Europe is not ready to, and is too slowly beefing up production and starting to think. So it's very volatile in the future. But I'm not entirely sure at this point regarding now Ukraine and all the policies that the Trump administration is much worse than the Biden administration. Sorry to say that. Very probably not politically correct. But frankly, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's
the realistic view from not only from the Baltics.
Yeger, I want to know your thoughts on this. When I interviewed the president, I think he was barely containing his anger about no invitation at the summit, and I guess I don't quite see how Ukraine deals with this unless the weapons that you need most are delivered. Because that's what President Zelensky said. Okay, if you're not going to invite us in, then give us what we need to fight by ourselves. And of course, the list is what we know, what we've been discussing: the Patriots, the F-16s, the artillery, the support for drone production. So can Ukraine go on alone is my question. And would it take all of the above weapon systems to really make it feasible?
I think this is several things, or this is the parts of one whole picture. So having enough weapon, we would be able to end this war as soon as possible. And after the end of this war, the invitation, it will be exactly in time for Ukraine and the accession of Ukraine in NATO, without Ukraine without war in NATO. And I think it will be the best time to do this, because if we have a look on the time when Baltic states were invited and became a member state, it was the time when Russia was so weak to react on something, or to react on this accession, and to stop this accession, or to do something to stop. Yeah. So I think this is not replacement, So this is, we should add weapon to invitation, because the more weapon we have, the sooner we will stop this war, and then invitation will be, like, as I said, just in time.
I'm just going to give you the last question since we're almost out of time. One of the viewers said 5 years out is probably realistic. I don't know if that's the case, but at the end of this period, what will Russia look like? Let me ask it slightly differently. If this war continues and Ukraine holds the line and we go into 2025, do you think Russia's economy and capacity will start looking differently? Is it possible that we will finally see Russia unable to muster the manpower or even to effectively use the weapons? When it comes to Russia, whose side is time on? And might 2025 be a better year for Ukraine in terms of Russia's capacity, economy, manpower, ability, etc.?
Well, who goes first?
Oh, I'm just going to give Ukraine the last chance here. Thank you very much.
Trudy, probably we spoke with the same senior intelligence officer and about this 2022. And he said that several conditions will be in the one point in 2025 for Russia. This is some political conditions, some economical, first of all, conditions. Of course, sanctions is working, but unfortunately not enough. And actually, Russia managed to avoid some sanctions through the third countries, and have a lot of gray imports of chips and other things. And they not only increase the production of their cruise missiles, but even develop a new one. And they already use it against us, this Zircon. So I think it depends on the sanction policy of European countries and the US, because we still have a space how to make it stronger.
Tighter.
Yes, for Russia. And if it's will be done, I think economy of Russia will suffer even more. But even now that we have some, we understand that Russia have some problems. Yes, they use a lot of their money to increase their production of their military production, but this is not the growth of their economy. This is artificial growth, because it works on the short distance. The results of this military economy, they will see the next year. So that's why probably I think this our common senior intelligence officer said about the window of opportunity for Ukraine in 2025 because of some problems in political life and in the economy of Russia.
From your lips to God's ear, as they say, and thank you both very, very much for this discussion. And I would love to talk to you both after the NATO summit. So goodbye to both of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for participating on behalf of the Central East European Coalition. I also thank you, Trudy, Yeger and Eerik, for sharing your thoughts. They were honestly very thought-provoking, and also just something to think about for the upcoming NATO summit. And thank you so much for everyone for joining in. Yes, please be on the lookout for future for CEEC online events on similar important topics on advocacyceec.org. And thank you so much. I think we're good.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.